So today we're going to go through and rebuild this raw steering box for the 3B. Now I have a replacement sector shaft for the original one that the splines were all twisted up on. So this replacement sector shaft that I have, I bought brand new. Now in the last video, or the video where we tore this box down, I had made mention some Willys guys don't like the aftermarket or reproduction sector shafts. Going through and researching online, what I found was mostly a lot of the issues or reasons guys don't like to run the aftermarket ones is because of an incident in 2016 that happened on a couple forums. Guys had replaced their sector shafts with aftermarket ones when out wheeling or just driving around, and this flat part of the sector shaft broke off from the shaft itself. So this will go to the pitman arm, this will go to the worm gear for the steering wheel. So if that breaks, then you have no steering. So looking into those specific issues those guys had, it seems at that point in time there was a certain manufacturer building these as two pieces. So they would have the shaft that they would machine and then this flat plate, and then they would either press on or slide on and then weld on the backside to keep the two together. And what was happening is during that welding process or somewhere in the manufacturing process, there was obviously a lot of stresses introduced into that. So with any amount of shock or load on the sector shaft, it would end up breaking. So looking at the original sector shaft, it's all one piece, and the only thing they add in is a piece of hardened steel on the back side, which is where the adjustment on the back cover rides, so that keeps pressure between these 2 points and the worm gear, and then obviously they add these 2 points separately. So in reading the forms a little bit deeper, it seemed the two-piece sector shafts were made by Onyx. Now in reading down a little bit further, guys were suggesting that Crown made them and they're all one piece, and that is what I have here. The replacement sector shaft made by Crown. It's all one piece. There's no welding, there's no joint that this part of the shaft is separate of this. At least the fact that these both look to be manufactured the same way gives me some confidence in this part. Now obviously all quality cannot be determined just by the looks of a part. In the forging process there could have been some stresses left in the part that weren't heat treated or relieved properly. So there's always a risk with replacing such a critical component, but if I didn't replace it, I don't know what sort of stresses are already built up into these twisted splines. I don't want to put that on and have it snap the rest of the way the first big bump I hit. So this is going to become a paperweight or wall hanger, and this is what we're going to be installing today. Alright, so let's jump right into the rebuild. So just want to say quick, the one thing I'm not replacing are the sector shaft bearings. Looking at them, they seem fine. There was minimal wear on the original sector shaft. When I put this new sector shaft in, there's minimal sort of side-to-side motion. So I think those bearings are still fine. The other thing is, if you decide to replace these, when you put the new bearing in, you then need to ream them out, because just the way the bearings are made or the process of getting them in, they may close in more than the sector shaft, so you can't get it on the sector shaft. Even this one, the new bearing is tough on that sector shaft. So if I were to put these in, I would then need to go through and ream them to make sure that the sector shaft would fit and that there's enough play around for the oil to get in between the bearing and the sector shaft. So the first thing we're going to start with is the seal for the sector shaft, and then we'll go through and get the bearings on the worm gear shaft. Alright, so now that we have the bearings in and the steering shaft in the box, so now we're going to go through and install this bearing retainer for the top of the box, and we need to go through and shim it. I'm going to put the original shims in and see where we're at. At least looking online, I wasn't able to see anything in terms of end play that we're looking for. It says no end play and you want some preload on the bearings. It seems to just be a by feel thing. I didn't find any sort of number to be able to measure by, so. I'm not feeling much resistance, so we'll go through, take a shim out, and that should move this cover plate down, put a little bit more pressure on the bearings. Alright, so there's definitely some resistance now. I took out 4 thousandths worth of shims. I think I'm going to put a couple thousandths back. It feels a little, some resistance, but it feels a little notchy. So I think there's too much pressure, so pull it back off, add a little shim, and we should be right where we want to be. Alright, so now that we have those shims all set, we can go through, install the steering column sleeve, and we're going to put a new support bearing in the top of this. So now that we have the steering column tube on, the next thing we need to do is snake the horn wire through, all the way through, and it'll come out the end of the box. And to do that, I'm just going to take some brazing rod, tape it to the end of the wire, and then feed it through, and I should be able to pull it right through. Alright, so now that we have the wire in, we can go through, and this is a little wire guard that'll snake in there, and then we tap into the bottom of the case. I'm going to put a little bit of RTV on this because there's no seal down here at the bottom of the case, so this is the only thing stopping the oil from just leaking out the bottom. So I'll try and seal it up the best I can, and once we fill it up, I guess we'll see how well that works. Alright, so now it's time to finally get this new sector shaft installed. Well, that's it. What we need to go do now, we'll put some sealant, put the gasket, put the cover on, and then on the cover there's a set screw that goes in, and that's what will sit on this piece of hardened steel inside of that sector shaft to keep pressure on the worm gear. So once we get this cover on, we'll put the pitman arm on, and then we need to paint this box up, get it painted, and then we'll get it installed and set up the drag link. So now that the paint is dry and we have the steering box installed, the next thing we need to do is go through and rebuild this drag link. And to do that, I just bought a little kit that comes with all of the cups, springs, spacers, and then threaded caps that we need, or threaded ends. So we'll get the cups installed, get some grease in there, and obviously we need to put it in place, slide the pitman arm or bell crank into these openings, and then tighten it up. So because they're spring loaded, it doesn't seem like there's a torque setting on these. So we'll just tighten it up enough to get the counter pins in, and then it should be all set. All right, so now that we have all the linkage set up, I was going through just cycling everything, making sure everything was all right. And there's two things that I found that are not all right. The first one being there's a noise in the top of the column when I turn to the right. I'll see if you can hear it. So obviously that's not right. Something in this top bearing. I gotta pull the wheel off and see what's going on with that. But the second thing is, so now we're cut all the way to the right, and if I come over here, so there's a gap between the stop and the knuckle, which means the axle is not turned all the way to the right. So what that means, the box is running out before it locks out on the axle. So since the box is locking out before the steering locks out, what that means is the pitman arm is not on the right spline. So I need to go through, pull the pitman arm off, realign that, probably move it one tooth, and then put it back on. But that now means that the drag link that I just put on and just locked the counter pin on, I need to now pull apart. Because this nut for the pitman arm is about 170 foot-pounds, so I'm not going to be able to get in here with a socket or the pitman arm puller to even pull this off with the engine there. So I need to pull the steering box out, so I need to pull that off, readjust everything, and then put it back in. Alright, so we have the box back in. We ended up moving that pitman arm 2 teeth over, and so now we can go from full lock, obviously to the left, and then if we turn it to the right, we still get that bit of that noise, which we'll talk about after. So now we can go all the way to the right, and we're at full lock, so that's touching to the right. Now with that noise, I thought it was initially the bearing up at the top, but we pulled the tube off. Obviously now there's nothing up here to even rub or make any noise, and it's still making some noise. I even went through and pulled out the wire guide, thinking maybe this was rubbing on the inside of the steering shaft. Not the case. So what I'm thinking it is now, I'm still playing around with the adjuster. I can sort of make the noise come and go somewhat by adjusting, either tightening up or slacking that adjuster. So it may just be the adjustment isn't set right, and that new sector shaft and worm gear sort of finding out how to live together. There's also no oil in this box yet, so I need to get some oil, fill it up, get this adjuster just right, and then we'll see. Hopefully that helps the noise. If not, then we'll dive back in and see what's going on. So the next thing to do now, get all of these tie rod ends torqued down, and then get a rough alignment set, at least in here with some tape measures. Alright, so now that we have the tires back on, I went through and just quickly strapped a couple of these rods to the tires so that we can get a measurement from the outside of the tire. We'll measure from the front and then the back, and that'll tell us obviously what the difference is, will be the toe in or toe out that this has. So if we throw the tape measure across it now, 60 inches and a 1/16 on the front, and if we go to the back, in the back we're about 61 and a 1/16. So that means there's an inch difference between the front measurement and the back, which means the tires are pointed in an inch more than the back. So we're looking for about a 1/16 difference between measuring the front and the back. So obviously we now need to spread the tires out to increase that front measurement. So with the way the steering is on this Jeep, because there's both of these tie rod ends connect to that belt crank, we want to try and evenly space them or increase that length between both of those tie rods. Alright, so we have the alignment pretty much close enough for now. Once we get the Jeep done, we'll take it to a shop and have them straighten it all out. So the steering system is pretty much complete. I just need to get some heavy oil for the steering box and put a couple more counterpins in. Now in an earlier video, I did say that I wanted to have this running and driving by the 4th of July. And obviously, there's still quite a bit of work left to do. So it may seem like we're really behind schedule, but really once we get the brake lines in, the master cylinder in, then we're pretty much able to set the tub on, and at least start mocking everything up. Now I'm not sure how much, we have a replacement tub for it, I'm not sure how much body work that's going to need, how many weeks that'll take, and then obviously paint and everything else. So I'm not going to throw a new completion date on it yet. I'm still hoping for this summer, this year to be running and driving, but at least we were able to get something checked off the list today, and then next time we'll start diving into that brake system and get that checked off. So as always, thanks for taking the time and watching this video, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.